On May 16, 2023, a fire broke out at the Loafers Lodge boarding house in Newtown, Wellington. The fire killed 5 people, destroyed the residence of 92 and launched several investigations.
Obviously this has been rough news for New Zealanders to wake up to this morning as we've seen the tragic events unfolding here in Newtown.
I spoke to Wellington Mayor Tory Whanau and former Prime Minister Chris Hipkins about the day of the fire and how they reflect on it 1 year on.
Taking us back to the day of the Loafers Lodge fire, when were you first alerted about it and its severity?
I think I remember getting a text message around about 4:35, just saying there's been a fire, head down there, be ready to talk to media. And I think at that time, I hadn't really clocked just how serious it was. I thought, fire, people are just waiting outside in the street, I'll go down and comfort them. That was my expectation in my head. But then I got there about 6 and there were me and about 10 journalists. And of course, Nick Pyatt from FENZ came out and gave a briefing. And I think when the feeling of the group was, this is fine, this is just another fire, we just have to report on it and deal with it. But when he came out and said there have been multiple fatalities, there was just this strong shock and emotion and somberness after he said those words. And I think as a group, we were all feeling very emotional about what had occurred. It was a huge shock. It was a huge tragedy.
Throughout that morning, you then go on to speak to first responders, speak to other leaders at the scene. What were their expressions and emotions like at the time?
It was, so Nick then took me to the building and took me through what had happened directly after that press conference, and seeing the pain on his face, seeing the first responders, how exhausted they were, it was incredibly heartbreaking, and just not knowing who had been impacted and who didn't make it out. It was certainly the most tragic thing I'd ever been part of.
Were you able to speak to residents on the ground there?
There were a couple, so most of the residents had been relocated to somewhere safe and warm and given food and of course prioritised for emergency housing, which was great. But we did have a couple of residents coming down just saying, I don't know where my friend is. And that was just so horrific. And they would come back and forth throughout the day. So I got to know one gentleman, and he spoke to media as well, and you could see that he was just reacting to this tragic situation, and it was heartbreaking.
It was pretty confronting, to see the devastation and just the speed with which that had all unfolded, and to see the state of the building. It was pretty in your face, yeah. I think any loss of life in those kind of circumstances is really tragic. I think what hit home for me is just how closely knit that community is. That's an area of Wellington where everybody knows everybody else. There were some real characters living in Loafers Lodge who were well known, around that part of the community. And so I think the community as a whole really felt that. And I personally knew one of the people who lost his life in that. I'd been at university with him, and he'd had an interesting and colourful life. Very, very honest and decent and caring person. And to discover that he'd been one of those people, which we found out about that time, was pretty heartbreaking, really.
There was sort of a lot of grief expressed, by the community. There was a Merrill Relief Fund set up. What do you sort of remember from those days following it?
I certainly remember the way the community there sort of came together and offered support to those who had been affected by the Loafers Lodge fire. But I also, recall the questions that raised, about boarding houses generally and whether we were doing this right. We kicked off a review as a government that already has resulted in some changes in terms of the way the building warranty fitness system works. I think there are broader changes to ask about whether sprinkler systems should be in all of this type of accommodation. And I hope that work will continue under the new government, because there are a lot of boarding houses like this around the country, and it's important that we make sure we have the right standards in place for them.
I mean, 1 year on from the event, I mean, what do you sort of reflect on? How does it reflect on the event, itself, but its implications on a sort of national scale?
I think it highlighted a number of things for me. One is just how vulnerable some of the people who are living in this type of accommodation are. They're often dealing with a whole lot of other complex challenges in their lives, and we need to make sure that we've got a secure roof over their heads while they work their way through that. For some people it's longer term accommodation, for some it's just short term accommodation, and we need to recognise that. Boarding houses have been in New Zealand for our entire history. This is not new. This has always been something that's been part of our community. But I do think we need to ask those deeper and more fundamental questions about what, if we're going to have boarding houses, is the standard that we've got for them the right standard? My gut feeling, having seen what happened at Loafers Lodge and then having looked at the reviews that have been done since then, is that actually we need to lift the standard here. These are very vulnerable people, and so we should make sure that we're providing a standard of accommodation and care for them that they deserve.
Following the fire, there are a series of investigations and audits into boarding houses similar to Loafers Lodge. Wellington City Council did an audit, one of the groups. MBIES also did a national review released in March. It found that the average age of these buildings was 60 years old. The majority of them weren't built for purpose, so they weren't built for accommodation. And 69% of the total issues with the buildings were related to fire. Reflecting on some of these investigations that have been done, what concerns have they raised for you and the state of this housing?
Yeah, of course. I think after that fire, I think everyone in the city and around the country really thought twice about the state of our buildings and the safety measures needed for our residents and how far did this issue go. So we were able to identify 25 similar buildings across the city, and 21 of them passed safety measures, and those that didn't, there were about 3 or 4, have been ordered to fix immediately. It meant that it was because it was such a priority, we added more staff to our warranty fitness and buildings team. A couple of other outcomes have been, there's now a website where anyone around the city can look up a building and get some details, safety details about that building. And there's now a code of compliance, which allows, or code of conduct, which allows people to look at our independent investigators as well.
Speaking to community representatives following the event, they've told me, some of them have told me that it may have been irresponsible as a community to let people live in a building like Loafers Lodge. Is that something that you agree with?
That type of accommodation is completely inadequate for our people. What everyone, especially our most vulnerable, need access to is warm, dry home with wraparound services. We know that many in that building, had issues with mental health and alcohol and or needing access to alcohol harm reduction services. I think that how we move forward as a community for those who are in that spot, they need access to those things. And I know we're working with Wellington City Mission to deliver a centre just like that. But I think that that's where we need to be moving to as a city and as a country.
When you think about the event a year on, what do you reflect on?
I reflect on how we as a city reacted to that event. What I saw is just so much compassion. I remember, so we quickly set up the mural fund, and council donated $50,000. Just after a couple of days, it raised $400,000, and that money went directly to the victims and those who were displaced. And I just saw the beauty of a community coming together to look after their most vulnerable. There was while it was tragic and upsetting and, can't even imagine what the families were going through, I saw a lot of heart from our Wellington residents, and for me, I think that event and the way that our city reacted to it was probably one of the most significant events that I'll ever be part of, and how tragic but beautiful and important that it was.